Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the OFFbit. My name is Dan Lopez and today is brought to you by the number 7. Yes, that's right, this system is full of 7s. We're testing the i7-4770 with the GTX 770. Now, this thing can't play the latest of AAA titles, however, it's not quite yet ready to be written off. We can still play a fair amount of games. How well can this machine run a handful of relevant online titles for late 2022? So stick around as we run this machine through our tests and we see if this system makes sense to be gaming on in late 2022.
The i7-4770 was released in June of 2013. This little beast has 4 cores and 8 threads, packing 8 meg of level 3 cache, running at a modest 84 watts. The CPU supports SSE 4.1, SSE 4.2, AVX and AVX2 instructions. So this CPU should be able to run a lot of the newest games. Though sometimes with some of those games, it may not be very good at all. The motherboard we're using today is the Gigabyte GA-H81M-S2H. This motherboard is an entry-level standard motherboard with no major bells or whistles, but gets the job done as we're not overclocking at the moment on this board, so it should be sufficient for what we're doing today. We've paired this motherboard with 8 gigs of G-Skill Sniper 12800 DDR3 RAM. This is a 2-stick kit of 2 4GB sticks of RAM. The GPU we've used today is, of course, the NVIDIA GTX 770 from Galaxy. This version we're using today is the GTX 770 GC. It has 2GB of DDR5 RAM with 3.5GHz memory clock and a 1.11GHz core clock. And we recommend using at least a 570W PSU when used with a standard desktop CPU. If you're using something bigger than that, you may need a bit more power. Finally, our drives we're using today, we have our operating system drive on an ADATA SU800 128GB SSD drive. We have the SP-A55 512GB SSD for games, as well as the old Western Digital Green 1TB magnetic drive for some of those less intensive games that don't need that memory throughput. We're also running Windows 10 build 1904. So let's stop hanging around this part and check out the benchmarks and just see how this system compares to other builds we've done on this channel in the past. In 7-zip, the i7-4770 had a respectable score, sitting just behind the i7-6700K in both single and multi-core scores, but with a wider gap towards the multi-core score. Furthermore, the i7-4770 was very much beaten by a fair amount against the modern i5-11400F. In CPU ID, the benchmarks showed a similar resemblance to the 7-zip benchmarks, with the i7-4770 was very much close to the i7-6700K, but was very much run out by the i5-11400F by a long shot once again. Finally in Cinebench, the i7-4770 sat behind the i7-6700K by about 100 points or so, and almost half the performance compared to the i5-11400F. The GTX 770 in Cinebench pushed out in front, beating the i7-3930K paired with that GTX 970. Something which is a little strange, however, this is a lot newer system than the Sandy Bridge high-end desktop 3930K. This also does show that this system as a whole package should be able to game quite well. In Unigen heaven, it paints a more accurate picture, pushing out the GTX 770 close to the 670. Our GTX 770 was only about 2/3 approximately of GPU compute power compared to the GTX 970. Finally, in Firestrike, our GTX 770 was just about 20% slower than the GTX 970, and showing a similar step in performance increase over the GTX 670. Now, checking out the games and the gameplay, we started off with Minecraft Bedrock Edition for Windows 10. Now, I really do think this game really does look quite good. With its simplistic style, it really does work, though it's not everyone's cup of tea. Since the last major update, Cliffs and Caves, this game has taken a bigger chunk out of performance out of the CPU, leaving older systems to turn down their render distances and maybe as well other graphics settings. Now, we ran this game at high details with a render distance of 26 chunks. This game ran very well on this system, though as usual we did have to wait for some chunks to load in when we were flying fast around the map. our benchmarks in Minecraft Bedrock Edition, we had an average frame rate of 60 frames per second. Our minimum frame rates hit 58.3 frames per second. Our maximum frame rates hit 61.6 frames per second. And the 0.1% lows hit 36.7 frames per second. Now this game does have a 60 FPS cap for us, but the real indicator of how well this game performs on this system is the 0.1% lows, which scored a high 36.7 frames per second. Like we said, this game does run really well on this setup. However, if you wanted a bigger draw distance, I'd have to recommend moving to a CPU that had more threads. Something with 6 cores, 12 threads would be able to crunch more of the world's data quicker than this i7 4770, which only has 4 cores and 8 threads. Now, since PUBG is a free game to play, we thought we'd give it a go and just see how well this game ran on this system. PUBG really was the battle royale game that kicked off the genre. On its release, it caused quite a bit of hype amongst gamers. Well, it did for me anyway. It was nice to come back to this game and just see where this game is currently at. Unfortunately, what I found is that I'm still trash at this game, and that hasn't improved. However, we're not interested about how bad I'm at this game. We're interested how this game runs on this system. Now, we ran PUBG at 1920 by 1080 with low to medium details, but we did set the draw distances to quite far. The game felt smooth and responsive and gave a good, enjoyable feel, something that is great and much needed for competitive games, just like this one. Now, we did run this game, and the benchmarks for PUBG gave us an average frame rate of 106.8 frames per second. Our minimum frame rates hit 59.9 frames per second, and a maximum frame rate hit 156.8 frames per second. Our 0.1% lows hit 15.2 frames per second. Once again, this game ran quite well on the system, and the data on the benchmarks showed that. Now, this game is nowhere near to be classed as a new game, though it still does have a relevant player base that makes this game still fun and captivating to keep playing. Another older but yet still played online game is GTA 5. There is something about GTA 5. It was such a big game for its time, and I really do think the polish in this game and its world was aimed for perfection, and they got pretty close to it, I think. With the amount of detail and just the amount of stuff that is put into this world, it really is mind-boggling. However, much could be said for the server-client network code setup for playing online. However, that's another debacle that we're not going to talk about today. This game pretty much ran flawless on this system. We ran GTA 5 at 1920 by 1080 with high details using the DirectX 11 as the renderer. The benchmarks we got for GTA 5 on this system today, we got an average frame rate of 64.5 frames per second. Our minimum frame rate hit 38.7 frames per second, and our maximum frame rate hit a whopping 267.9 frames per second. And it also gave us a 0.1% low frame rate of 28.9 frames per second. Now, the i7 4770 paired with this GTX 770 will net you all day pretty much perfect gameplay if you're aiming for a 60 FPS gaming experience. Yes, you will experience the odd dip in frames, but really this game runs pretty much perfect on this system for the most of it. Next game we jumped into was Apex Legends. Honestly, I've not played much of Apex Legends, and at that I haven't played probably enough. Really, it's a game I need to invest some time and have a look and give it a real go. Now, the graphics do look pretty good in this game, and it also has a quite nice feel, though we were running the game at low to medium settings with a resolution of 1920 by 1080. Now, the benchmark showed that Apex Legends gave us an average frame rate of 82.1 frames per second, a minimum frame rate of 53.9 frames per second, and a maximum frame rate of 145.4 frames per second. Our 0.1% lows hit 44.8 frames per second. Data shows this game runs quite well on this system. We did need to pull back some of the settings originally to get the game to run well. However, we do have a bit of buffer there to up the graphics if we need to, as the game ran really well in the end. So all in all, Apex Legends on the i7 4770 with the GTX 770 runs quite well and will give you a great competitive gaming experience. This game on our list today was Overwatch 2. Yes, this is a new game for 2022, but it really does run well on older systems. The game looks magnificent and plays fast and smooth. Overwatch 2 is a great multiplayer team game with a few tweaks from the original Overwatch, such as 5v5 teams opposed to the original 6v6 teams. There's also a few hero tweaks here and there, and I'm sure that will change over the course of time. Ran Overwatch at 1920 by 1080 with 100% resolution on high details. Now the benchmarks for Overwatch 2 gave us an average frame rate of 113.2 frames per second. Our minimum frame rates hit 72.2 frames per second. Our maximum frame rate hit a big 161.6 frames per second. And our 0.1% lows hit a frame rate of 30.8 frames per second. Now this game is action-packed and there's always a battle going on. So high frame rates is something that you want in this game and something that this system can deliver. The final game on our list today is Fortnite, one of the most popular games to be playing in 2022 online and will most likely be like that for the future. It's one of those games you either love or hate. Now, Fortnite has just recently been overhauled to run the Unreal 5 engine for Season 4, so the system requirements have stepped up a bit. But for that sacrifice, for high detail users, the game looks absolutely magnificent now. May have cut off some of those lower end users. We did run Fortnite with medium-low settings at 1920 by 1080 at 100% resolution. The game ran fairly smooth for the most of it, but we did have a few spots where we suffered load lag. Now the benchmarks for Fortnite for Season 4, we got an average frame rate of 81.6 frames per second. Our minimum frame rates hit 36.5 frames per second, and our maximum frame rate hit 132.2 frames per second. Our 0.1% lows hit a frame rate of 5.3 frames per second. As the data show, the game runs quite well with some high frame rates, but it does have some big dips at times, something that was reflected in the 0.1% lows. This is something that can be problematic if it catches you exactly at the wrong time. However, it does only last a split second or two, and it shouldn't hinder the player that much, even though they may say it did. All in all, Fortnite runs on this system quite well, and should net you a good game experience overall.
Now, summing up this system as a whole, the i7-4770 still has good potential to play newer games. However, we felt it was held back by the GTX 770. Now, the CPU in this system, the i7-4770, did have some headroom for overclocking, which we did not use. So we could easily do that by overclocking the boost clocks on all cores, which is done quite easily in the BIOS. Now, the other thing I'd like to also address is that i7-4770, it's not a new CPU, and an i5-11400F, as we saw in the benchmarks, absolutely blitzed this CPU, and that's not an expensive CPU. So you have to sit and think about what's worth doing. Is it worth getting an old system, or is it worth getting a new system? And that really had to come down to your budget and where you hold your values. Now, the biggest problem with this was the GTX 770, and the big problem is that it's no longer supported by NVIDIA, same as the 600 series. Now, this was pointed out by Andrew McEwen in the last video, and we thank you for that. So the problem is that any newer games will use newer game engines, and also some game engines are getting upgraded on older games, and they will either run and crash or just not run at all. Now, a few of the games that we ran into that had this problem was Red Dead Redemption 2, you could run it, but it would crash. Warzone 2, you could run it, but it would crash as well. And Halo Reach did not want to run at all. So there's the problems, there's the list. So if there's going to be probably more games on that list, but anyway, that's where it's at, and that's what I think the problem is with this system. Other than that, that is all we have for today. I think this is a great system. If you pick one up on the cheap, it's going to be a great little system and has gaming potential. However, like I said, you need to look at the pros and cons of going to a newer system. Well, once again, that's all we have today for the Offbit. Thank you for watching us. Now, we'd like to thank our Patreon supporters for supporting our channel, and just keep on doing that. It's just helping us go along here. Also, if you like this video, please hit that like button, and if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button. So thank you once again, and we'll catch you guys next time on the Offbit.